So thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar that will provide an overview of the Pandemic and Response and Recovery Toolkit for Homeless System Leaders in Canada, which is set to be released within the next week. Just a bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be sent out later today or tomorrow to all those who have registered. It will also be posted on the Canadian Network for the Health and Housing of People Experiencing Homelessness, or CNH3 resource webpage. Everyone is muted. We have about 60 minutes of content followed by time for questions, and throughout I will be monitoring the question box and the chat for questions at the end. My name is Marie Morrison. I'm the Director of Built for Zero Canada, and I am your host for today's CAEH webinar. Our primary presenter today is Ian DeYoung, President and CEO of ORDCODE, and he is joined by Tracy Flaherty-Wilmot, ORDCODE Associate Director, who together are the co-authors of the Response and Recovery Toolkit. ORDCODE, of course, is well known for working with communities across Canada and the US and other parts of the world to end homelessness. ORDCODE is a partner within Built for Zero Canada, also CAEH training and technical assistance for by name listing coordinated access, as well as further work with the Canadian Shelter Transformation Network. We are very thankful to have them have worked on this toolkit and for presenting with us here today. The Canadian Alliance works with all of you to end homelessness in Canada, and we're doing that work primarily through these 4 key initiatives. But along with you, we're now working on the goal of ending homelessness within the context of responding to COVID-19. So this includes the homelessness sector COVID-19 information exchange, which began as weekly meetings and surveys and have now moved to every 2 weeks, and also includes a Facebook group for peer information exchange. The Recovery for All advocacy campaign was launched last week. If you have not yet done so, we encourage you to sign up on the website and to help spread the message. And through CNH3, we've been developing resources and curating and regularly updating a clearinghouse of COVID-19 documents and tools for the homelessness response sector. Part of these resources have included webinars, and today's webinar is the 10th in a series that began on March 18th. ORDCODE has presented in 2 of these previous webinars, the first on response to unsheltered homelessness and the second on prevention and diversion, and of course today's webinar. This is the CNH3 resource page, and you can find all of the webinars here, and you will find the toolkit here when it is released next week. We're just finalizing a few elements, but we wanted to give you a sneak peek and an overview of what is coming. I wanted just to give a bit of background around sort of the rapid fire process of developing the toolkit. The CH team began talking about this in April, thinking ahead and knowing that communities would be looking for support and direction following the initial response of COVID. And so we talked about and engaged ORDCODE May 8th, asking them to build off a couple of documents already produced in the US, including the HUD Recovery Toolkit, which focuses on all disasters, not just pandemics, and then also the recently released NAEH framework. With those organizations' knowledge and permission, we wanted to take those ideas and put them in a Canadian context and make sure that they were focused on pandemics and COVID-19. We released a 1-pager we'd already begun working on with ORDCODE for leaders to pose some questions for consideration when making strategic investment decisions, both during the initial response and then the second wave. So that was like an early taste and version of some of what was coming. ORDCODE had the toolkit drafted by May 20th, which was incredibly quickly, and really thank you to them and the CH team and other partners and some community leaders who provided feedback, some initial feedback. So we're just, again, putting the finishing touches on the document. We'll plan to release it next week, and then we'll continue to be updated as we move forward. And like it has been for yourselves and communities, it is a bit like building a plane while you're flying it. So we'll be also continuing to learn from you and others and to lift that up and share it out as we move forward through the next phases of COVID. So with that being said, and no further ado, I will pass the slides over to Ian with ORDCODE.
Thanks, Marie. A real honor to be with you all today from across the country. So what I'll be walking you through is the work of Tracy and yours truly from WARCode. We've had great input from the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, who are the sponsors of this work. The initial idea to create the Canadian Recovery and Response Toolkit was inspired by those documents that Marie just mentioned. But one of the things that was really important for the sponsors of this, the Canadian Alliance as well as WARCode, was making sure that this was a Canadian document and wherever possible, a pan-Canadian document, one that would resonate from coast to coast to coast. And the intended audience for the document are people who are in system leadership positions, so not necessarily executive directors of organizations per se, although if you're here and on the call or webinar, or if you look at the disaster response framework, you'll see that everybody has a role to play in community to get to the place where we have effective response and recovery. So the system leader might be leading or tasked with tracking some of these functions, but we certainly are not suggesting that everything that's discussed today falls just on the shoulders of the system leader. And those system leaders are going to be things like service managers, CBOs, community entities, different people tasked with leading policy, planning, and executing funding decisions throughout the country. So just a bit about us. We are located or headquartered in Oakville, Ontario. We do work primarily in the United States and Canada, although do some work in Australia. And we are fiercely committed to working towards ending homelessness in all that we do. We try to advance ideas, and a lot of the ideas that we advance come from generating and curating the promising practices that are found in other jurisdictions, and then try to anchor them within a broader body of knowledge, or to promote promising practices that other people may not have heard of yet. And we do share resources like the development of this document with Canadian Alliance, and offer training that hopefully, anyway, doesn't suck. So this is a toolkit in 6 parts, and I imagine that you're busy people, and so let's get through the preamble and get into the meat of why we're here today. One of the hardest parts of preparing the toolkit was organizing it and editing it. We've gone back and forth with various orders and groupings of material, which I will walk you through. There are other materials that lay on the editing floor, so you might say, hey, where's this? And we might have said it somewhere along the way. We took that out just for brevity. And because you are busy, structuring the toolkit in 6 parts was designed so that you could find the part of the toolkit that would be most relevant for you and your community based upon where you're at in your response and recovery to the pandemic. So how do we navigate the toolkit? So there's 6 parts to the toolkit, as I just mentioned. Part 1, this purpose and preamble, a bit of the where are we at, who the toolkit is for, and the way that the toolkit is structured. So just kind of a notice to reader of how the flow works within the toolkit. Part 2 is about assumptions, realities, and the service orientation. It's in this section you'll find commentary about the importance of maintaining the mission of preventing, reducing, and ending homelessness, and the importance of housing first. There's also commentary about the importance of inclusivity and equity in the disaster response and recovery. Part 2, as we will come to in a few minutes, also outlines the disaster phases with descriptions of each, which can be helpful for system leaders and colleagues in your community to determine where service providers and the system as a whole is, both practically and emotionally. In part 3, we have got to the place where we realize that for some system leaders, this may be the only part that they're interested in, and it could function as a standalone piece. For those of you familiar with the American Pandemic Recovery Framework for the homelessness serving sector, this part of the document will look quite familiar. The constructs are the same as the American document, but the information and material have been Canadianized as necessary and relevant. And we're going to spend a good chunk of the webinar going through this section in particular today. In part 4, we look at operationalizing the pandemic response from and recovery framework. From the initial situational assessment, we journey to getting the response in the right order, and then look at preparing to reactivate a response if there are surges or a second wave, and how to collect and use data and engage in improvement science using PDSA cycles. Part 5 is really short. It's concluding thoughts and where we go from here. And another part of the document that is likely to be very relevant and used is a number of checklists and a funding source table that are all included in the compendium of resources as an appendix. As mentioned by Marie, and I want to just reiterate again, All elements of the toolkit will be updated on a regular basis. And at this point, we're saying until at least August 2020, but beyond August as necessary and new information comes to light. So how to use this toolkit? Well, that's going to really come down to where you and your community are at and your response. So we have tried to ensure that it has several different uses, knowing that there has been diverse responses to the pandemic throughout the country and the homelessness serving sector, and because different communities are in different places when it comes to recovery and planning. So here are some of the things you can do with the toolkit. You could reflect upon and evaluate what's already transpired. That's really leaning into learning to make refinements in response in the present, but also to position yourself and lessons learned to make larger changes as necessary through medium and longer term planning. Then the toolkit can help you situate your future planning, including being prepared for a second wave. Maybe there are things you would do the same, and maybe there are things you do differently if you need to reactivate a response. And some of that you might know intuitively or feel within your community. This might be a way of collecting that knowledge in such a way that it can frame the conversation a bit better within your community. The compendium that comes with the document has different types of checklists to help system leaders. These vary from personal reflection tools, like how system leaders are doing with self-care, to more system-wide reflections on things like a reactivation response. Many communities have had to develop new policies as part of the response. Others have realized that some existing policies need refinement or may need to be scrapped altogether, and we hope that the toolkit will help inform some of those processes. And as more resources become available, system leaders will need to navigate how to get the money approved at a local level and out the door, and then monitor the investment and its impacts. The compendium contains a table of all known funding sources that may be relevant to the people we serve, whether homeless specific or not. Undoubtedly, one of the challenges is going to be helping people we serve apply for and access additional provincial, territorial, or federal benefits or funding that are more general in nature, while also navigating the impact of receiving those benefits. So for example, one community pointed out to me that accessing new federal funding was making people in their community no longer eligible for a bus pass because they were over an income threshold. Many communities are in the process of engaging more fulsomely with service providers to try and sort out a direction moving forward. So this is not the sort of engagement that you've had operationally up to this point. This is more the strategic engagement of where are we going from here. And it's hoped that the toolkit can help structure an agenda and some of the content that is necessary to help you in those conversations. And lastly, developing and implementing an evaluation framework may be born out of the toolkit. In particular, the 4 phases of immediate, short-term, medium-term, and long-term all lend themselves to a review of whether the action steps were taken and results were realized. So we are hopeful that it could be a benefit in one or more of those ways. We felt it necessary to name some of the assumptions and realities that we have, while also anchoring the tool within a shared service orientation. So the first thing that we wanted to say is that across the country, there's been more than one approach to respond to the pandemic within homeless response and housing supports. Sheltering is a really good example of that. Some places thinned out their shelters, lots of places use motels, but not every community used them for the same population group. Or let me give you another example. Some organizations moved to entirely remote housing supports. Some had a combination of remote and in-person housing supports, and others operated housing supports more or less the same as before the pandemic, albeit with physical distancing. There's some tension regarding the second item on this list. Housing ends homelessness, but there are many places that had to pull all of their energy and attention into the immediate homelessness response for a period of time and lacked the bandwidth to focus on housing or coordinated access, at least for a while. Sometimes this was because of how many staff they had. Sometimes this was about politics or optics. Sometimes this was about housing navigator or locator availability. Sometimes this was access to income supports to help in the process of getting people housing. It goes on. We should collectively be focused squarely on the mission again of preventing, reducing, and ending homelessness, and the toolkit drives towards that aim. There's been an increase of talk in some corners of recovery planning, sometimes called reconstruction or post-pandemic planning. It's likely some people or even entire communities think they're in the space, in that space because it feels slightly different now than it did in the early days or weeks. However, it's our impression that across the country, we're more or less in a post-peak period, not a post-pandemic period, and the toolkit adjusts the action steps that are necessary while we're still in a pandemic. The disruption we are seeing in homeless services and housing supports could have a silver lining. If done right, we could use the time as the most important time in our industry's history. So for example, the appetite might be right to cease operating some poor performing programs and to reinvest that funding to another part of the system. Or now may be the time to forever change shelter services in your community to be prevention, diversion, and housing resolution focused. Or it could be the time to critically examine street outreach or the roles and functions of drop-ins. It could also be the time to re-examine assumptions that went into prioritization for your local coordinated access process. Some people may want to return to how things were before the pandemic. But we should be clear that that's probably not going to happen. And maybe it shouldn't either, depending on your community. In some, if not many parts of the country, we also need to closely examine inclusion and equity in our response and planning. If not already doing so, for example, we need to ensure people with lived experience have more than a token voice in the process. One of the other assumptions that we're making is that there's an effort to stay true to housing first. One of the cautions my American colleagues have pointed out to me from their experience with Hurricanes Katrina and Harvey is that some people never before involved in homelessness will be exposed to it for the first time. That's things like community leaders, business leaders, some politicians, etc. As the saying goes, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. So some of the newcomers to our work might go down the road of compliance or treatment first if not educated and provided data on the importance of housing first. Another caution pertains to some people in positions of leadership who want to structure the response, funding, and execution differently than how the system of care is currently designed. Don't be surprised if there's a push to create parallel systems, not one homeless response system. The thinking and experience from other jurisdictions in the US dealing with disasters is that there will likely be a voice or two who suggest the following: that people became homeless because of the pandemic should be treated differently and access resource differently from those who were homeless prior to the pandemic. When that happens, it provides the appearance, at least, of there being a deserving and undeserving population to be served through recovery. One of the other great advantages of talking up housing first is that it emphasizes inclusion. Housing first has never been the change who you are so I can give you what you need intervention. It has been the you are who you are and I will customize supports to meet your specific needs intervention. We also would be remiss by way of setting context if we didn't point out that system leaders were addressing and dealing with at least 3 intersecting crises. So system leaders were already dealing with homelessness. System leaders were in many communities already dealing with opioid use. Many system leaders were in the space of helping to plan and address the needs of people who use opioids who also happen to be homeless. And another layer that we can add now is COVID-19. So whether your community or province or territory has seen big numbers or not is irrelevant. The threat of the pandemic caused upheaval that became a crisis. Now, I want to be clear that we have debated whether or not we should add a 4th circle to these intersecting crises. And that 4th circle is one of racism, and that discussion started even before the most recent events in the United States. In particular, what we've been thinking through is whether or not this response and recovery framework could be a time to more appropriately address some of the systemic racism experienced across the country, and in particular as it relates to people who are Indigenous. We didn't put it in the framework now because, and you can research this on your own, there's debate about whether or not racism meets the public health definition of a crisis. So we've reluctantly parked it for now, but as we've mentioned, this is a living document and it's entirely possible we'll see a 4th intersecting crisis named on this graphic. For at least the last 2 decades, researchers that have looked at disasters have attempted to articulate the different phases of a disaster and the collective response. There seem to be at least 6 discernible phases, sometimes called slightly different things. We start with pre-disaster, the green on the left. And that's the warning time that communities had to prepare for the pandemic, which frankly wasn't very long. In the pre-disaster phase, people began to have their initial emotional and intellectual responses to the threat. Some people likely immediately jumped in to respond and prepare, while others likely cowered and resisted involvement. On impact, the psychosocial, personal safety, and financial effects of COVID-19 began to be understood. The greater the scope and depth of the outbreak in the community or region, the greater the psychosocial impacts on its members. This has been an event that impacts both personal and professional lives. In the heroic phase, the goal is to prevent loss of life by whatever means necessary. And you know you're in the heroic phase when feel-good stories of altruism are sought and shared. It also feels good because resources begin to arrive in larger quantities, moving from an initial response to a more sustainable response. And that heroic phase leads to the honeymoon. In the honeymoon, the initiation of relief efforts gives people comfort and boosts morale. Those most impacted by the disaster can desire recovery to be quick, so they have a chance to return to normal sooner rather than later. The honeymoon phase of the disaster response is characterized by a short-lived sense of optimism, before entering into a very predictable disillusionment phase. With time, there's a sober realization that things will not be the same as they were before the pandemic. Those impacted realize that there are limits to available assistance. The optimism present in the honeymoon phase wanes while disappointment, anger, and frustration become common. If recovery delays set in or become unduly bureaucratic, some people will turn away from government or community assistance and try to take care of things on their own, usually with limited success. And in the reconstruction phase, emergency and initial surge responses to address the pandemic subside and close. It's not uncommon for people impacted to experience setbacks and flashbacks and may have trauma from the disaster that has not been dealt with appropriately. People are adjusting to the new situation and realizing they must do for themselves what was previously done by others. Over time, grief and anger may be replaced by acceptance or even optimism. I like this graphic, which comes from SAMHSA in the US, because it illustrates three other features of the disaster phase construct. The first is that there are a range of emotional highs and lows. The second is that there is a passage of time. Is it always as predictable as demonstrated in this graphic? Probably not the exact same in every community. But I think acknowledging the passage of time and how people's response to the disaster changes over that time is important. And the third feature that I wanted to highlight is that the line is not smooth over time. It's not all up or all down. One day you can be feeling optimistic and the next feel crushed and defeated, and that's normal. In these times, it may be fair to say that one or more system leaders across the country may have run themselves ragged. Sound about right? And I bet amongst those system leaders on the webinar today that some of you have done a good job of recovering from the initial push, but there's others of you listening today who feel like it's Groundhog Day and that you're never going to get ahead. I won't belabor the point. Leaders need to practice good self-care, or there's a stronger chance that their resentment will keep the people they lead in the disillusionment phase for too long. Which is a nice segue into this section. On the one hand, it can be overwhelming to organize so many others to help. On the other hand, as the saying goes, many hands make light work. So we need to examine a broad range of other entities that can be involved in the response and recovery process that likely need some sort of connection, convening, organization, or navigation on the part of system leaders. And this was through a brainstorming exercise. So it's entirely possible that we'll be adding to this list as we go through. There are, of course, some obvious ones, like elected officials. There are other ones where we want to be in a position where we're engaged with, let's say, people with lived experience or elders within the indigenous community, and we think it's really important that there are voices of things like people with lived experience and culturally appropriate resources like elders included in the process. I suspect some of you remember the early days of the pandemic response and what seemed like one funding announcement after another after another. Some of those were specifically about responding to homelessness, while others are broader, and while it may be eligible to people who are homeless, it wasn't designed specifically for people who are homeless or wasn't specifically for the homelessness response sector. Chances are resources will be needed to help people navigate the funding they're eligible for. And at the same time, make sure in the navigation process that people don't lose certain benefits as a result of accessing new benefits. System leaders may also struggle to keep abreast of the different funding announcements that may be relevant to the population served. So for the next few months, we're going to be doing our best to keep an up-to-date list in the appendices of the toolkit, and would urge you to come back on a regular basis and see if there's any changes in the funding part of the compendium. All right. To paraphrase one of the reviewers in the process, this is the section that got their heart racing, and maybe not in a good way. There are 4 major themes we're going to walk through across 5 focus areas. We're going to deal with those focus areas first. So we're going to deal, just to be really clear, there's 4 major themes, and within each major theme, there's 5 focus areas. So these aren't in any order of importance. These are borrowed directly from the American Framework on Recovery that was part of the initial inspiration to develop the Canadian Response Toolkit. If your community has unsheltered persons, there will need to be a specific strategy. If you do not have unsheltered people, you can start with shelters. When we ask, what are the specific needs of people who use shelters? That will include motels and convention centers and other temporary facilities that have been put in place in your community. Next up is housing. And what we're really looking at here is the access part of housing. Can people still go to unit viewings and sign a lease and get their shelter allowance or startup benefit or whatever they may be entitled to in your jurisdiction? And from there, we're going to look at housing support side of things through homeless prevention, which includes all of the ICM or ACT or rapid rehousing or follow-up supports you do in your community, as well as other types of prevention work and diversion. And finally, for each phase, we're going to look at strengthening the system, which is where concerns like inclusion and equity planning will be examined. There are 4 phases or groupings of passage of time that we'll use in the framework. Immediate steps are well underway or completed at this point. Short-term steps are likely well underway or completed to this point. So when you think about those 2 time frames relative to your review and use of the toolkit, you may use those in your evaluation or review, or to help you if there's a reactivation for a surge or second wave. Medium-term steps, some communities are starting to enter the space of. Others are just about there. Others will likely get there a bit later in the summer. System leaders can use the toolkit as a reference point for what to plan and engage in next. And longer term steps from at least a planning perspective likely need to be fully engaged by late summer or early fall, although you might be starting to plant some of the seeds for that now. I want to be really clear that work across these phases is not entirely consecutive or confined to a specific phase. Rather, a lot of work begun in each phase will continue throughout the duration of the public health response into the recovery phase and beyond. We won't spend oodle of time on immediate actions, given it's well underway or completed in most communities. Our focus here is on equitably protecting all people experiencing homelessness from COVID-19 infection and illness, helping flatten the curve of community infections while reducing demand on healthcare resources. Efforts are integrated with a public health and emergency response. So what are some of the action priorities that we would take beyond the summary that you see on the screen in front of you? So for example, with unsheltered persons and those immediate actions, we would be doing things like teaching, equipping, and applying the use of appropriate protective equipment in street outreach. We'd be training street outreach staff on physical distancing and other safety considerations in street outreach, including administration of Narcan during the pandemic. We would likely have implemented non-congregate shelter options for people living outdoors, applied screening and testing protocols, and large-scale outreach efforts for people sleeping outside. Many communities have had to create and apply safe transportation options and or ensure access to hygiene resources, either outdoors or nearby facilities, things like toilets and showers and wash basins and laundry and soap. And there's likely been a lot of communication materials generated for unsheltered people. We've also had to see testing and monitoring of people who are unwell or unsheltered. We've had to also address infrastructure needs like food security, if your community experienced food insecurity as a result of changing or closed programs during the pandemic. And we should be engaging people with lived experience to ensure the response on sheltered homelessness is in fact adequate. In the shelter realm, much like outreach, we would have started in that position of teaching and applying personal protective equipment, but we would have seen other shifts in shelter, like shifting buffet or cafeteria style food service to prepackaged meals or more individualized servings, training shelter staff on physical distancing, applying testing protocols in shelters, ensuring that we're delivering sheltering still in the best trauma-informed way that we can, even with so many directives being thrust at shelters. Securing and opening new non-congregate settings to provide isolation and quarantine units, respite beds, alternate care settings, and temporary shelter options for others. And perhaps even looking at those shelter options by population groups, the needs of women, the needs of youth, etc. We likely have also seen in your communities, because we've certainly seen it in others, amendment to processes, procedures, or policies so that shelters can function in as low barrier, culturally appropriate, non-discriminatory, and readily accessible manner as possible. We also saw the huge push to reduce occupancy within existing shelters, if required to do so to meet with physical distancing. In the housing world, in those early stages, we saw continued support to some rapid resolution efforts for those especially who became newly homeless. Intensified efforts to house people via coordinated access happened in some communities, making sure that there's still outflow to housing from people experiencing homelessness, and getting those communication materials right with community partners who might be involved in the housing process, such as a different organization that does the housing search and landlord liaison process. In prevention and diversion, some jurisdictions experienced moratoria on evictions jurisdiction-wide, and that was appropriate as an immediate action. And we also saw in prevention and diversion, making sure that people understand who are already housed and supported, understand what their supports are going to look like in the pandemic, or any amendments to the process. So in some communities, for example, that meant doing remote supports to people who are already in housing as opposed to in person. And then in strengthening systems for the future, we start to see the homeless response and the broader public health system response become better integrated. We start to see data collection becoming really important to understand our experience. We see documentation and assessment of the impact that it's having on marginalized and vulnerable communities right from the very beginning. And in particular, based upon your community, there may be subgroups within that broader population you want to pay attention to. And we wanted to make sure that our strategies had broad geographic reach. But on top of these 5 areas of attention, the unsheltered, shelter, housing, prevention, diversion, and other key activities, or strengthening the systems for the future, there's a number of action items that the system leader was also engaged with in the immediate response. So let's see if any of these sound familiar. Getting representation or having a conduit with your local emergency planning table, putting new service agreements in place or amending existing ones, either with nonprofits or private vendors like motel operators or food services or security companies. Putting together temporary shelter locations, establishing specialized shelter spaces for survivors of violence, arranging transportation, addressing food security, safety and health screening, putting together IT services for temporary facilities, working with the purchasing department, accessing immediate funds, putting together medication management services, in some instances, working with children and youth services, to make sure, for example, that people who work in the homelessness response sector have access to childcare. And then establishing protocols and supports for service animals and pets, and pulling together interagency contacts, and well, the list seems to go on and on. If that makes you feel exhausted, that's all the work that you've probably already done, which leading into short term may also be work that you've done or already have put in place. This is where, beyond that initial immediate response, we start to focus our efforts on short-term planning. And these include things like revisiting whether or not your outreach strategy has been comprehensive enough in locating and mapping encampments, as well as testing. Continuing to make offers of shelter and housing to those who remain unsheltered and recording those efforts. Soliciting input from faith-based organizations, neighbors, businesses that are open, and people with lived experience to identify where outreach efforts can be expanded or refined to reach people not previously engaged. And that's especially true at or near encampment sites that are not occupied during visits from outreach teams, but there's evidence one or more person may be staying there. Within shelters, in that short-term action phase, even beyond the immediate, some communities realized they had to increase capacity even more to have non-congregate shelter options, especially for people who are higher risk, who are symptomatic, as well as people that need to be relocated from existing shelters to decrease occupancy rates to comply with physical distancing. We also, in the shelter realm, continue to see screening and testing expanded in those short-term actions, re-examining those policies and procedures again beyond just what was required in an immediate sense. Providing shelter housing options for people exiting quarantine or isolation shelters that cannot return to their initial location, and making sure that as we were assessing whether access was equitable to new and existing shelters. And of course, we have to continue things like harm reduction activities and supports to people who use substances as an example of other work that continues at this time. Within the housing realm, important, if you haven't already done it as your short-term actions, to examine your data to project the demand for different types of support and housing needs. The more you can be in a position of having a business case established that actually says that you've done your homework to know demand, the easier it is going to be to get into the medium and longer term planning phases where execution and implementation of expanded space may become the reality. For housing and the shorter term actions, we also had to make sure that coordinated access is robustly tracking availability of housing and support opportunities, and the matching continues, that the discussions of the need for more permanent housing through new builds, remodels, or acquisitions is happening as relevant in your community, that landlord engagement was enhanced, and that we're monitoring data that exits to housing are equitable. So is there any group that's been disadvantaged by the processes we put in place? We should be doing that right from the very early stages. And then as prevention and diversion unfolds, we have to adjust the volume of supports and housing as existing tenants adjust to the new reality. For some, this will be more supports. For some, this might be less. We also have to prioritize supports to existing tenants that are at a higher risk of re-entry into homelessness and identify if the type and intensity of supports needs to be different from pre-pandemic supports. We also should be enhancing front door diversion activities at each shelter or for the entire shelter system to prevent people from experiencing homelessness. We should identify and dedicate investments for eviction prevention for people housed through any of our community's rehousing and support programs. And then in terms of other key activities, we should be promoting equity-based decision-making within intersectoral partnerships. We should be monitoring and assessing data to ensure that testing and screening is being administered equitably, and we should be doing some cross-sector planning for moving forward. And from there, we start to move into the medium term, which I suspect some of you have started into and some of you may just be entering into. And I want to be really clear and stress that where you're at is where you're at. This isn't a competition or a race. So as we start to get into the medium term and longer term actions, if you're not there, or if I'm about to mention items that you haven't thought of yet, there's no need to freak out. There's still time to plan. So now when we get into medium-term activities and we think about unsheltered people, now we need to do things like a complete case review and case conference process for all people remaining unsheltered, and to do so with the purpose of determining if the lack of movement inside is a result of service barriers that need to be resolved, whether it's because of a lack of capacity, whether the individual had a previous poor experience of trying to be inside since the pandemic started, and or if it's their personal choice to stay outside. So from there, we should be really developing personalized support plans for each person that desires to go inside, with a pathway and timeline for achieving that result through shelter or housing. And then for those unsheltered people who are not going to move into housing, we should have a personalized support plan for each of them put in place too, which may look different from the sort of service planning we did in regular pre-pandemic outreach efforts. So these types of support plans might include information and as necessary support with things like physical distancing within an encampment, hygiene, harm reduction, food security, where and how to access survival supports. Then as we move into the sheltering realm, if necessary, we're going to have to amend or increase non-congregate shelter capacity. We may also, as part of our medium-term actions, come to realize that some of the facilities that we are using, once evaluated, are not actually conducive to a continued pandemic response. And therefore, we might need to change facilities or look at other opportunities to still meet public health guidelines and maximize shelter opportunities for people in a safe and appropriate way. For housing, in medium term, we're going to emphasize that housing is a solution to homelessness and public health concerns. We're going to make those amendments as necessary to coordinate access prioritization criteria and other processes. We're going to create individualized service plans for each unsheltered person that wants housing, as well as each person in a motel or non-congregate shelter to access housing, whether that's through coordinated access or if they have the means to do so outside of coordinated access. Want to step up our landlord recruitment and retention activities. A scale up investment in time spent on intensive housing supports is necessary to assist with a higher volume of people about to access housing, and coordinate the administration of all types of housing subsidies, and if possible, to do so from one location. And then also update housing need projections in light of data from the pandemic. In the prevention and diversion space, this is where we put in place front door diversion and prevention resources system-wide with flexible financial resources to customize problem solving. We focus eviction prevention efforts on those with very low income and start to expand that to people with moderate or higher incomes only if we have the resources to do so. And work with provincial territorial income support programs to partner on prevention support activities, standardize our approaches to prevention and diversion as much as possible. And then also work with child welfare, corrections, and healthcare institutions to improve discharge planning and reduce the inflow to the home service sector at this time. And then other key activities: examining timelines and end dates of eviction moratoria, additional income assistance, and other related initiatives, and using the data to analyze and project impact on the homelessness response system. We also want to analyze data in particular on returns to homelessness and customize supports for each returning household to try and exit them back to housing rapidly. And then we also want to assess the impact of our equity-based decision-making. The other items likely to be led by the system leader at this time: things like refining operations that are continuing, initiating a longer-term planning process, reorganizing some community resources to focus on housing acquisition and housing maintenance as necessary, focusing on housing as part of the recovery process, retooling prioritization and coordinated access permanently if necessary, begin planning new service options and winding down temporary options, expanding housing and landlord liaison services, innovating and transforming and revisiting unsheltered homelessness response and strategy. And the final big bucket is the longer term actions. As system leaders work with their community to engage in longer term planning, there can be a tendency to, yet again, wish that this was all over already. Furthermore, there are some who think longer term planning is returning the homelessness response system back to how it was prior to the onset of the pandemic. And depending on where you're at in the country, that may be short-sighted or impossible. This is in fact a unique opportunity to focus on recovery for all, to borrow a Canadian Alliance phrase. It's a unique opportunity to redesign the homeless response system forever. Starting again with the focus on unsheltered and progressing from there, we are likely to engage in the following. With unsheltered persons, continuing to monitor, especially newly unsheltered people, which includes people who have left your shelters, including your overflow or temporary facilities, to become unsheltered, especially as the weather is changing throughout the country. And we likely are going to enter into space which will be uncomfortable and perhaps necessary in many communities, not from a system leader perspective, but where other partners are concerned about how are we going to respond to encampments moving forward. Where shelters are concerned, we probably need to look at our shelters that existed prior to the pandemic and do long-term planning with them. And that long-term planning may result in loss of beds, and that loss of beds may make them not viable anymore. If that's the case, part of our longer-term planning has got to include shelter replacement. It is quite possible that communities will have a smaller number of beds and a larger number of facilities just to sustain the number of shelter beds they had pre-pandemic. Because it takes a while to site, zone, fund, acquire, build, etc., those efforts need to start sooner rather than later. So by end of summer, early fall at the latest, we need to be in that space, is our projection. In longer term planning, we also begin to close surge spaces permanently. So not the reconfiguring or moving those spaces, but saying the additional surge spaces we added, like motels, convention centers, etc., Now we're going to work on closing them down. In the housing realm, connecting people to housing supports based upon their specific needs, continuing to implement plans to expand supportive housing options, and begin assessing interests and commitments from multiple sectors to support housing investment across various affordability levels based upon the projections that you have in place. For prevention and diversion, assess and strengthen system-wide diversion and prevention implementation. Continue to support people who have exited homelessness with customized case management. And if prevention needs of low-income people have been sufficiently met, you might want to expand the income eligibility criteria even further for eviction prevention assistance to include moderate incomes. And those other key activities: strengthening coordination and partnership between homeless programs and health programs, including public health, mental health, physical health, and substance use supports. Documenting the strengths and weaknesses of a community's response to the pandemic, and examining data to communicate the impacts of COVID-19 on homeless persons, and break out data on specific population groups like Indigenous persons if necessary to demonstrate health disparities and inequalities, and document promising practices. The many other actions that system leaders need to take during this time include things like structuring renovations of existing projects. I'm not suggesting the system leader is doing the renovations, but they may have had to organize or work with the community to organize things like access to funding, timelines, where people will go in the interim. Winding down facilities that are no longer needed. Winding down their participation in the emergency response table, and evaluating lessons learned. Obviously, writing fancy words on paper about what goes into a framework is one thing, and bringing the actions of the framework to life is something completely different. I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about our thoughts on operationalizing the framework. As is the case in a professional practice such as this, the next steps can only be determined after slowing down a little bit, assessing the current situation, and considering the most appropriate approaches and strategies that will allow partners to continue focusing on the ultimate goal of ensuring safe, appropriate housing options for everybody. The system leader, in concert with trusted advisors and peers, should work through the following assessment. Situation. Where's our community and our system regarding COVID-19 pandemic phases? What's happening? What partners are actively collaborating? Who's being served well and who's not? Mission. What's the next phase to be tackled, and how do we ensure that the mission does not get lost in the shorter term objectives related to ongoing pandemic response measures, even for those communities experiencing the post-peak period of COVID-19's first surge? Execution. How will we continue to promote prevention and containment measures while preparing for post-pandemic operations within a transformed reality? What lessons have been learned so far, and are all action steps still incorporating housing as paramount for recovery? Coordination. Who is doing what? Are cross-sector communications and collaborations effective? Is data being gathered on modified service delivery for future analysis? Timelines. When will each action element be completed? Although there are many things that are outside of our immediate control during disaster response and recovery, timelines that detail anticipated milestone and accomplishments promote hopefulness even in periods of ambiguity. In questions and confirmation, what else needs to be clarified? Now, system leaders are not expected to have all the answers, but the role that they often play is one of asking the important and pertinent questions to ensure that decisions and activities move the system to successful housing-focused recovery for all. One of the things fairly obvious in the early stages of pandemic response is that some communities did not strategically roll out their response, and as such had to redo some of the work. So for example, without knowing which shelter options are available, how do you communicate to unsheltered people what their options are? So there were some communities that said, we need all of our outreach staff to go out and tell people there's a pandemic. So you had outreach staff that went out and said, there's a pandemic. And we hadn't yet equipped the outreach workers with, and here's the additional shelter options, and here's the testing sites, and here's physical distancing. So we want to make sure, not that we're holding these things off, and it could just even be that the sequence of these things is driven by hours of separation as opposed to days of separation. But let's figure out how we're going to do screening and health services. And then let's figure out where our shelters are going to be. Then, while those things are occurring, like I said, it could be a matter of hours, not a matter of days. Then we can go out and tell people who are on shelter what the shelter options are and how they can get tested. Then we can start to examine for the people that we're already supporting in housing, how do those support services need to be different? Then we can say, okay, now that we've got people into these new shelter facilities, what needs to change in coordinated access? And now we can start to say, okay, well, we're learning things that we need to codify in policies and procedures, and we should evaluate. So maybe the stairs aren't the best example to show this continuous improvement progression through these steps, because so many of these things are overlapping. But we do know, based upon some of the conversations and I'll call it a light evaluations we've done thus far, that one of the missteps experienced by lots of communities was not getting the order right. And that will be important if we have to reactivate for a second wave or surges. A separate webinar can be held just on these housing and support options, but for the sake of today, I'll reference these at a high level. When thinking about housing and support strategies, we would encourage the community to think beyond that which they have already had and figure it out if now is the time, and if they need is there, how can they go about implementing other or additional strategies in their approach to accessing housing or providing supports. Suffice it to say, the response and recovery that takes place with housing and support services will be critical and perhaps the most important positive legacy that comes from the pandemic. So will we need access to private rental housing and work with landlords? Yes, we will. Might we need a different type of access to supportive housing, social housing, or other types of rent-geared income housing? It's entirely possible we will. Might this be the time that a community considers, for example, as many communities are, or I shouldn't say many, at least several communities are that we're aware of, acquiring some of the motels that they currently have people staying in and converting those motels into permanent shelter or SRO type housing? It might be that this is the time to do that. And across all of those different options, we need to layer on different types of support, from the type of engagement that would allow an individual or family to achieve the maximum amount of independence with the lightest possible touch, to really intensive, prolonged, and perhaps even permanent support options. In this last section, we're going to look at some simple but important performance measures to track and provide a high-level view of the PDSA cycle. For communities that use HIFIS, we suggest you check out the HIFIS How-To series and how HIFIS can support COVID-19 response and recovery. For those of you who have worked with us before, you know that ORCODE harps on these three performance metrics a lot. In our experience, getting these metrics right makes analysis and understanding of the system easier. For each of these metrics, you can further filter data to better understand what it's telling you. For example, you can break out each of these by gender or age or COVID status, or whether or not the person identifies as Indigenous or frequent service user or acuity level, etc. You may find it beneficial to look at 3 months prior to the pandemic and compare it to services during the pandemic, or maybe you want to look at the same 3 months last year, March, April, and May, and compare it to the same months this year. Or if your March was spent just in implementation mode and you weren't focused at all on any sort of housing access during that period of time, then it might make sense to look at April, May, and wherever we're at in June and compare those to April, May, and or June of last year, or the preceding 2.5 months prior to when the pandemic hit. For each of these, we want to look at both the mean and median, and we want to be able to understand whether or not the impact of the pandemic in our response has had a positive or negative result on how long people are staying homeless, how many people are exiting homelessness, and returns to homelessness. Built for Zero Canada are the masters of the PDSA. And I would encourage any listener on the webinar that is interested in this concept to follow up with them if you yourself are not part of a Built for Zero community, in which case you probably know this like the back of your hand. There are a series of improvements that can and maybe should be tested at this time of flux in the system of care. Innovation opportunities may never come along again like we have right now. If we use a structured process like a PDSA, we can record what has been attempted and whether it was abandoned, adjusted, or adopted. So as we look at our communities, our organizations, and our response to COVID-19, there's likely one or more problems that you could identify. That your analysis of that problem through both data and communication should lead to potential solutions, of which you're going to select and plan a solution. on a test basis. You'll be able to evaluate whether or not that test resulted in the sort of change that was beneficial for the system, and then adopt, adjust, or abandon. Amidst all of the unease and uncertainty at this time, we also have considerable opportunities. We can advocate and work to ensure there's recovery for all. We can analyze and understand our systems of care and make mid-course corrections as needed. We can take deliberate steps to make sure system leaders are taking care of themselves so they can better lead reconstruction efforts. We can ensure each system of care has the opportunity to be better off than before the pandemic began. And it's our hope that the information, diagrams, concepts, and checklists that we pulled together into the Pandemic Response and Recovery Toolkit will help you and your community in the pursuit of ending homelessness. Please stay in touch if there's any way the ORCode can assist you at this time, or if you have any questions. We'd also encourage you to like ORCode on Facebook and like us on Twitter so you can stay up to speed with what we're offering at this time. And with that, I will turn it over to Marie to moderate questions.
Great, thank you very much, Ian. We do, and I wasn't able to respond to them as we were going through I didn't have my mouse, so I'm just going back to some of them here. So someone asked, are the slides going to be shared and available? Yes, both the recording and a PDF of the slides will be available. I can just confirm that. We also had a comment feeling that the conversation so far was not sort of inclusive of Indigenous homelessness. And, you know, I think that's good feedback to hear, and thank you to that person. I don't think they're any longer on the call, but certainly noting that. Going to the question box now. Under prevention, is there a reason that you did not include people that will maybe losing their housing through evictions when the provinces list the prevention and eviction orders? Manitoba will be lifting one at the end of June of 2020. And I think, you know, that's true of many provinces across the country who have put eviction moratoriums in place. Can you speak a little bit, Ian, about that and how it might be included in the guide?
Yep, so the prevention and diversion parts includes both. And if I didn't make that clear, my apologies. So it includes both those people that you're already supporting in housing that you might have gotten housed through a Housing First program, supportive housing program, intensive case management program, or rapid housing, that sort of stuff. So that's one part of prevention. The other part of prevention and diversion are going to be those people who are newly homeless as a result of things like moratoriums on eviction ending, or the economic unemployment situation. So we'll start to see that. And we certainly have suggested that in your short, medium, and long-term action phases, that consideration be given to planning of all those people who may have the experience of facing homelessness, who are going to be your priorities. And the lessons that have been learned in disaster responses, and these mainly been natural disaster responses from some other places, is really encouraging to focus those prevention investments in the earlier stages on very low income people and people with high needs. So the sort of person that's low income and may have some other life issues that would benefit from additional supports, we want to engage them first. And then in later terms, starting to expand whatever prevention resources you have to moderate and higher income people, but starting with the people we've already housed in support and programs, as well as if there's people newly experiencing or on the face of homelessness, starting with lower income people with higher needs first.
That's great. Thank you. I encourage folks to put any questions or thoughts, further thoughts, in the chat box or the question box. That was a lot of great information that was shared, and I'm sure people are interested in digging into the actual materials a little bit more. And again, we're going to be having that posted on the website, on the CNH3 website next week. So you can be watching for that. I'm sure there will be some announcements and social media pushing out and letting folks know that that information is now posted. There may be people typing in So a question, do you have thoughts on how to engage provinces and how to work with community on preventing homelessness when the orders are lifted?
Started talking with my mute button on, but I remember to take it off. I'll let Tracy chime in on this one as well, but I think that the key to success when these orders are lifted is going to be, in those initial stages, a monitoring. We can't actually predict how many people are going to experience homelessness or evictions when those orders get lifted. We can posit that it's likely going to be many, but we don't know the actual quantity. So if we were to start from a planning perspective and you were to ask me what's going to be the volume of people that are about to experience homelessness who haven't experienced homelessness before, I don't know how to answer that. But if we were to say in those early stages, especially as we start working through additional rent cycles, now we're going to understand the overall depth of demand. So I would say from a planning perspective, asking provincial representatives what their strategy is going to be. If their strategy is going to be, well, the homelessness response system is going to take care of that, I would be having the conversation now about resources. And I'm not just talking about financial resources, I'm talking about human resources. Are we going to have enough people who work within our system of care to be able to actually address the volume of people, even though we don't know the volume? So if you have that first month and it's 100 people or 1,000 people or 10,000 people, that's going to give you some sense right from the very beginning, so you can let your provincial representatives know we're going to track the data. But I wouldn't assume that the homeless response system has the capacity to deal with the volume of prevention resources that are likely going to be necessary in provinces like Manitoba when they lift the moratoria.
And I'll just add to that, this is Tracy, so thanks for the question, Betty. Some of the things that community partners have already started to do from a system leadership standpoint is having those province-based discussions with income supports, whoever is sort of operating that financial component, to really talk about what's going to be the strategy as income support recipients may suddenly not be able to pay the rent, and maybe they've taken, not paying their rent even if they could have, because some people may actually see it as I don't need to pay. The other piece from a system leadership standpoint is an awful lot of housing and homelessness system leaders are starting to have conversations with, again, the province as it relates to residential tenancy boards and figuring out how this is going to be handled across the province. So those are the two things that I've heard from some of the community partners that I've had contact with, and trying to do it in advance, just like within our homeless response system, we're likely already connecting with people that are currently being housed and supported from within our rapid rehousing or housing first programs to make sure that those third-party payments of rent or that rent is being paid, and that people understand a moratorium from eviction does not mean that you don't have to pay. So trying to activate those other provincial bodies to also be helping people access supports and benefits in advance of receiving an eviction notice. So hopefully that'll help.
Thanks, Tracy. And I'll add in just a few other thoughts and things I've heard from other communities is definitely some are anticipating some of that and are holding back some of their money, waiting to see what happens, not knowing if that's enough, but knowing that they want to think of some of that ahead of time. And as you said, Tracy, really reaching out and pushing out the message, like, please come talk to us now, we're available, making sure to let folks know that, don't wait until the end of June, like we're ready and available to talk to you now about options and where you're at with thinking about your rent. And then I've heard of communities also thinking about how are we going to, if we are overwhelmed with requests, and Ian, back to your, comment on priorities, like, do we have tools or processes, and have we had the conversation in our community that, not ideal, but if we're needing to prioritize some of those responses, how are we going to do that as a community? I don't know, Ian or Tracy, if you have further thoughts or if you've been hearing some of those things as well.
I think the biggest component around this is the recognition that, you know, in addition to those individuals who may receive immediate eviction notices because they've been unable to pay their rent during COVID-19, and, you know, right now the moratorium is ensuring that they're not evicted in the interim. But I think one of the really important components around this is, as we're sort of waiting for that moratorium to be lifted, we also have to be aware of the fact that generally when it comes to situations and disasters like a pandemic, that there is a lag in people needing to access homeless services beyond the financial crisis. And so I think doing the prioritization around how are we going to make the most of the finite prevention resources we have will prove to be really important, because I would envision that for most provinces that have a current moratorium on evictions, you won't just see this rush of people who are in need of support as soon as the June moratorium is lifted. That deadline passes, you will likely also see it into the fall and into the winter months where people have done everything that they possibly can, but they financially just can't stay in their unit. And so the prioritization is going to be really important as you head down that road for prevention.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Great. Great thoughts. All right, I am not seeing any other questions at this time, but certainly if folks have thoughts or want to follow up with any of us after, you are welcome to do that. We really thank everyone for your time today. Thank you, Ian and Tracy, for that very thought-provoking presentation. We hope that you will join us for future webinars, and I wish everyone a good rest of your day. Thank you so much.